If you sign page 47, your company won't belong to you by Christmas. The sentence sliced through the boardroom so sharply that even the projector seemed to hum quieter afterward. For half a second, nobody moved. Then the laughter started. Low at first, a chuckle from the far end of the 20-foot marble table. Then another. Soon the room filled with amused smirks and expensive disbelief beneath the golden chandelier light of the Whitmore Grand Hotel's executive suite on the 42nd floor. Maya Bennett stood near the wall holding a silver tray of bottled water, her black service uniform pressed neatly against her shoulders, her name tag catching the cold white glow from the recessed ceiling lights. She immediately wished she could disappear back into the wallpaper like she had done 1,000 times before. One executive leaned back in his leather chair and laughed openly. Did the waitress just interrupt a $4 billion merger? Another man adjusted his cufflinks and shook his head slowly. This is exactly why staff shouldn't be allowed in high-level meetings. Maya's fingers tightened around the tray, but her expression stayed calm. Across the room, billionaire CEO Edward Whitmore finally looked up from the contract in front of him. His pale blue eyes landed on her with the detached irritation of someone interrupted during something important. The Manhattan skyline glowed behind him through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, rain streaking softly down the outside panels like silver veins. "Excuse me," Edward said quietly. His voice wasn't loud, but the room instantly abated. Maya swallowed once. Her heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat, but she forced herself to speak clearly. "The clause on page 47 activates a silent voting transfer after the second earnings report," she said. "If the market dips below 7%, control shifts automatically." Silence hit the room for exactly one breath before another burst of laughter exploded louder than before. Graham Cole smiled without warmth from the opposite end of the table, his polished watch glinting beneath the lights. "That's impressive," he said dryly. "Did YouTube law school teach you corporate acquisitions too?" Several executives laughed again. Maya felt heat climb into her cheeks, but she didn't look away. The air smelled faintly of espresso, printer ink, and expensive cologne. Somewhere near the windows, ice clinked softly inside a crystal glass. Edward Whitmore slowly closed the folder in front of him. "Who allowed hotel staff into this meeting?" he asked coldly. "Sir, she was only serving drinks," one assistant answered nervously. Edward's jaw tightened. "Then she should focus on that." Maya lowered the tray carefully onto the side counter before speaking one more time. "Then why," she asked softly, "does the override clause only begin after your company loses majority forecasting protection?" This time, nobody laughed. Graham Cole's smile disappeared almost instantly. A faint crease formed between Edward Whitmore's brows as Claire Whitmore, seated halfway down the table, suddenly pulled the contract closer toward her laptop screen. The tapping of her keyboard echoed through the boardroom like distant rain. Maya stood perfectly still beneath the chandelier glow while the entire atmosphere inside the room slowly began to change. Claire Whitmore stopped typing. The faint clicking of her keyboard vanished into the heavy silence hanging over the boardroom. Rain continued sliding down the glass walls behind the executives, turning the Manhattan skyline into blurred ribbons of silver and gold. Maya Bennett could feel every pair of eyes in the room pressing against her now, but none of them looked amused anymore. Claire slowly lifted her gaze from the laptop screen toward Graham Cole. "The transfer mechanism is real," she said carefully. "It is buried under the restructuring language." One executive shifted forward in his chair so abruptly that the wheels squeaked against the polished floor. Another reached for the printed contract with trembling fingers. Graham's expression barely changed, but the confidence in his posture tightened almost invisibly around the shoulders. "That interpretation is exaggerated," he replied smoothly. "Complex mergers often contain conditional safeguards." Maya remained standing near the side counter beneath the dim chandelier light. Her pulse still raced beneath her uniform collar, yet her voice came out steady. "Not safeguards," she said quietly. "Control triggers." Edward Whitmore leaned back slowly in his chair, studying the young woman in front of him with a colder kind of attention now. His eyes narrowed slightly. "How," he asked, "does a hotel server understand executive acquisition law?" The question floated through the room like smoke. Maya hesitated for half a second, long enough for someone near the windows to mutter under their breath, "This should be interesting." She ignored it. 3 years ago, I studied finance at Columbia, she answered. I left before graduation. Graham gave a dry smile. And now you serve sparkling water to people who finished school. A few nervous laughs scattered weakly around the table, but they died almost immediately. Maya did not react. She had heard versions of that sentence her entire life. Different voices. Same meaning. She remembered standing outside a grocery store in Brooklyn at 16 while a woman clutched her purse tighter just because Maya walked too close behind her. She remembered professors who praised her essays but still seemed surprised every time she earned the highest score in class. She remembered the quiet exhaustion in her mother's face every night after dialysis treatments. Bills stacked on the kitchen counter beside unopened envelopes marked final notice. Reality had a way of crushing pride faster than ambition could rebuild it. So Maya worked. Double shifts. Early mornings. Late nights. Anything that kept the apartment lights on. Edward tapped one finger slowly against the leather armrest of his chair. If what you are saying is true, he said, then you interrupted a $4 billion transaction because you happened to recognize a clause while serving drinks? Maya nodded once. I recognized the wording because I wrote a research paper on silent equity transfers during hostile acquisitions. One of the executives blinked hard. Another quietly removed his glasses. Claire looked back toward her screen again, scrolling rapidly through the contract pages. The blue light reflected sharply across her face now. Dad, she said softly. The transfer activates exactly where she said it does. No one spoke after that. The room felt different suddenly. Smaller somehow. The hum of the ventilation system seemed louder against the silence. Maya glanced toward the massive windows where rainwater rolled down the glass in uneven streams. She knew she should probably leave. She was not supposed to be standing inside this room at all. But before she could step away, Edward Whitmore asked the one question that made the air tighten all over again. What else did we miss? The question settled over the boardroom with the weight of something dangerous. What else did we miss? Nobody reached for their drinks anymore. Nobody checked their phones. Even the assistants standing quietly along the walls seemed frozen beneath the cold white lights reflecting across the marble table. Maya Bennett looked down briefly at the contract spread open near Claire Whitmore's laptop. The pages were covered in polished legal language designed to sound harmless to anyone moving too fast to notice the trap hidden underneath. She knew that style. She had studied enough acquisition cases at Columbia to recognize when greed dressed itself up as technical wording. Graham Cole folded his hands calmly in front of him, but Maya noticed the tiny twitch near his jawline. The first crack in his composure. You are allowing a hotel employee to derail a legitimate merger over academic theories, Graham said smoothly. This is becoming unprofessional. Edward Whitmore did not look at him. His eyes stayed fixed on Maya instead. Answer the question. The air tightened again. Maya took a slow breath. Outside, thunder rolled faintly beyond the Manhattan skyline, low and distant like something waiting. The override clause is only the beginning, she said quietly. Claire's fingers immediately returned to the keyboard. Maya stepped closer to the edge of the table now, careful, hesitant, fully aware she did not belong in this world of tailored suits and billion-dollar conversations. But something deeper than fear kept her standing there. Page 52 restructures voting shares after projected losses, Maya continued. But the losses are artificially built into the forecasting model itself. One executive frowned. Artificially, Maya nodded once. The energy division projections were reduced below historical averages. The market decline assumptions are exaggerated by almost 12%. Claire stopped typing again. She is right, she whispered. A ripple moved through the room. Chairs shifted softly against the polished floor. Someone muttered a curse under their breath. Graham gave a restrained smile. Forecasting is interpretation. Not when the assumptions ignore your own quarterly reports, Maya replied calmly. That landed harder than she expected. Edward Whitmore slowly reached for the financial packet beside him, flipping through pages with measured precision. His expression remained unreadable, but the silence around him felt sharper now. Maya could hear rain tapping gently against the windows behind him. Tiny sounds suddenly mattered in rooms like this. Breathing, paper turning, the faint buzz of electricity from the recessed ceiling lights. Graham leaned back slightly in his chair. And you noticed all this while carrying bottled water? Maya met his eyes for the first time. No, she said softly. I noticed it because I used to believe numbers told the truth. The room went still again. Claire looked up at her with something different in her face now. Not pity, not amusement, respect. Maya felt it immediately because she was not used to receiving it in places like this. Edward closed the packet slowly. Why did you leave Columbia? The question caught her off guard. For a second, she almost said nothing. Then she remembered her mother sitting beside a hospital window in Brooklyn, pale beneath fluorescent light, while machines hummed beside the bed. She remembered overdue rent notices, night shifts, empty refrigerators. Life had not given her the luxury of choosing dreams over survival. My mother got sick, Maya answered quietly. Tuition stopped matching after that. No one interrupted her this time. Graham's confident smile faded another inch while Edward Whitmore stared at the young woman standing beneath the chandelier glow in a hotel service uniform that suddenly looked very different from before. Then Claire's eyes widened sharply at something on her screen. Dad, she said carefully, almost unable to believe it herself. If this merger closes exactly as written, Graham's firm quietly gains operational control within 18 months. The words seemed to drain all the oxygen from the boardroom. Operational control within 18 months. Nobody moved after Claire Whitmore said it. The rain outside had grown heavier now, streaking against the 42nd floor windows in silver waves while thunder rolled faintly beyond the skyline. Maya Bennett stood near the edge of the marble table with her hands loosely clasped in front of her, trying to ignore how hard her heart was beating beneath her service uniform. Across from her, Graham Cole finally stopped pretending to smile. His polished calm slipped just enough for everyone in the room to notice it. That is a dramatic interpretation, he said carefully. Control transfers require multiple performance conditions. Claire turned her laptop slightly toward her father. Every condition is engineered to fail, she replied. The forecasts are manipulated to trigger the transfer automatically. One executive quietly removed his glasses and rubbed both hands across his face. Another stared down at the contract like it had suddenly become something poisonous. Edward Whitmore remained perfectly still at the head of the table. That stillness somehow felt more dangerous than anger. Maya noticed the tiny muscle tightening near his jaw as he read through the highlighted sections Claire had marked. The room no longer looked powerful to her now. It looked fragile, like one wrong sentence could crack everything open. Graham folded his hands together slowly. Edward, you are letting emotion override business judgment. No, Edward replied without looking up. I am finally reading the contract. Silence crashed down again. Maya glanced toward the rain-covered windows and saw her own reflection faintly staring back at her through the glass. For a second, she almost laughed at how absurd this all felt. Just 12 hours earlier, she had been carrying towels through hotel hallways while calculating how many extra shifts she would need to cover her mother's medication bill next month. Now billionaire sat frozen because of words she almost kept to herself. Graham leaned forward carefully, lowering his voice into something smoother, more persuasive. This merger still benefits Whitmore Holdings long-term. Temporary restructuring is standard in acquisitions this size. Maya shook her head before she could stop herself. Not when debt exposure is hidden inside projected losses. Graham's eyes snapped toward her immediately. You need to stop speaking like you belong at this table. The sentence landed harder than shouting would have. Maya felt the sting of it in her chest because deep down, part of her still believed it herself. She looked down briefly at the silver bracelet around her wrist, the cheap one her mother bought years ago from a sidewalk stand in Brooklyn after Maya got accepted into Columbia. Her mother had smiled so proudly that day. Never let rooms like this convince you that you are smaller than your mind, she used to say. Maya lifted her eyes again. Maybe I do not belong here, she said softly. But neither does a contract designed to steal a company. Nobody laughed this time. Claire slowly sat back in her chair, staring at Maya with open disbelief now. One of the older executives whispered under his breath, "Good God." Edward Whitmore finally closed the contract completely. The sound echoed sharply through the silent room. Then he looked directly at Graham for the first time since the meeting shifted. Did you think nobody would notice? Graham's expression hardened. I think you are making a mistake listening to someone serving drinks instead of your legal advisors. Edward stood slowly from his chair. The skyline lights reflected across the glass behind him like cold fire. No, he said quietly. I think the mistake was assuming she would stay silent. For several long seconds, nobody in the boardroom spoke after Edward Whitmore's words landed across the marble table. The rain hammered softly against the towering windows while the city lights beyond Manhattan blurred into pale streaks through the storm. Graham Cole remained seated, but the smooth confidence that had carried him through the evening was beginning to fracture around the edges. Maya Bennett could feel it happening in real time. The room no longer belonged to the loudest voice. It belonged to the truth nobody wanted to admit had been standing there all along wearing a hotel uniform. Graham gave a quiet laugh that sounded forced now. Edward, think carefully before you destroy a partnership over assumptions from someone who has never sat inside an executive boardroom. Maya lowered her eyes for a brief second. The words should not have hurt anymore. She had heard versions of them her whole life. But somehow they still did. Not because she believed them, but because she was tired of having to prove her intelligence before people allowed her humanity. Edward slowly walked around the table, one hand holding the merger contract at his side. His expensive shoes moved silently across the polished floor. She noticed something every legal advisor in this room missed, he said evenly. That concerns me far more than where she works. The temperature in the room suddenly felt colder. One executive quietly loosened his tie while another avoided looking directly at Graham altogether. Claire Whitmore remained focused on her laptop, scrolling through page after page with increasing disbelief. There are more irregularities, she said carefully. Several projected liabilities are duplicated across different divisions. Graham finally stood from his chair. Enough. His voice cracked sharper than before. You are allowing this meeting to spiral because a server with half an education wanted attention. Maya felt the sentence hit her chest like ice water. Half an education. The phrase echoed inside her mind because it touched the one wound she carried everywhere. Columbia University. The unfinished degree. The dreams folded away beside overdue hospital invoices and pharmacy receipts. She remembered leaving campus for the last time carrying 2 cardboard boxes through cold October rain, while other students rushed toward futures she could no longer afford. Graham looked directly at her now. People like you always mistake intelligence for authority. The room went completely silent. Maya noticed Claire slowly stop typing again. Even Edward Whitmore's expression shifted slightly at the ugliness hidden beneath Graham's polished tone. But Maya did not look away. Her hands trembled faintly beside her, so she folded them together to hide it. No, she said softly. People like me just know what it feels like when powerful people assume nobody is paying attention. Graham opened his mouth to answer, but Claire suddenly turned her laptop around toward the room. The glow from the screen reflected across everyone's faces. The transfer structure routes operational voting rights directly into Cole Capital, she said. Not gradually. Immediately after the second projected loss cycle. One executive muttered, Jesus Christ. Another sank heavily back into his chair. Edward Whitmore stared at the screen for a long moment before lifting his eyes toward Graham again. This time there was no uncertainty left in them. Only disappointment. You built this entire merger to take control of my company. Graham straightened his jacket carefully. I built a contingency plan. Edward's jaw tightened. You built a theft disguised as paperwork. The silence afterward felt enormous. Maya suddenly became aware of how tired she was. Her feet ached inside her black work shoes after 14 straight hours at the hotel. Her mother was probably awake in their Brooklyn apartment waiting for her late-night call after dialysis. Real life still existed outside this glowing room full of billionaires and contracts. Maya slowly reached for the silver tray beside her. I should go, she said quietly. But before she could step away, Edward Whitmore looked directly at her and said something nobody in that room expected to hear. No, he said carefully. Please stay. The room stayed silent after Edward Whitmore asked her to remain. Not the comfortable silence of finished business, but the heavy kind that settles after people realize they have witnessed something they cannot undo. Maya Bennett slowly lowered the silver tray back onto the side counter. Her fingers brushed against the cold metal edge while rain continued tracing soft lines down the towering glass windows overlooking Manhattan. Somewhere far below, car horns echoed faintly through the storm, distant and small compared to the stillness inside the boardroom. Graham Cole stood rigid beside the marble table now, no longer pretending to be relaxed. The charm was gone from his face. In its place sat irritation sharpened by exposure. Claire Whitmore quietly closed the laptop in front of her, but nobody rose from their seat. Nobody reached for the contracts anymore. The merger documents lay scattered across the table like evidence after a trial. Maya became painfully aware of her own appearance under the chandelier lights. Black service uniform. Comfortable shoes bought on clearance. A tiny coffee stain near the sleeve she had not noticed before. Just an hour ago, those details were all anyone in this room could see when they looked at her. Edward slowly walked toward the windows overlooking the city. His reflection moved faintly across the rain-streaked glass. How many people reviewed this contract? He asked quietly without turning around. One executive cleared his throat. 3 legal teams and 2 financial firms. Edward gave a small nod that carried no satisfaction at all. And the only person who caught it was serving water. The words landed harder than anger would have. Maya looked down briefly, unsure what to do with the sudden shift in atmosphere around her. She had spent years learning how to make herself smaller in rooms filled with wealthy people. Speak less. Look down. Move quietly. Blend into the background before someone reminded her she did not belong there. Survival taught habits that success never fully erased. Graham adjusted his cufflinks with controlled movements. You are romanticizing coincidence, he said coldly. She found one interpretation among thousands of pages. Maya finally looked at him again. No, she replied softly. I noticed because I have seen what happens when powerful people assume nobody poor is smart enough to question them. The room fell silent once more. Claire's expression shifted at those words, something reflective passing through her face. One of the older executives slowly removed his wedding ring and rolled it absently between his fingers, staring at the contracts like they had personally betrayed him. Edward turned from the windows at last. His blue eyes settled on Maya differently now. Not as staff, not as an interruption, as someone real. What was your mother's treatment for? He asked unexpectedly. Maya blinked, surprised by the question. Kidney failure, she answered quietly. Dialysis 3 times a week. Edward nodded slowly. The hard corporate distance in his posture softened almost invisibly for the first time all night. That is why you left school. Yes. Rainwater slid down the glass behind him in slow silver rivers while the city lights flickered through the storm. Maya suddenly remembered sitting beside her mother during late-night treatments while studying finance textbooks under hospital fluorescent lights because she refused to let the dream die completely. Her mother used to fall asleep holding Maya's notes in her lap. You were never meant to stay invisible, she would whisper whenever Maya started doubting herself. Graham gave a quiet scoff. This has become emotional theater. Edward's gaze snapped toward him instantly. No, he said sharply. This became reality the moment someone in this room decided intelligence only mattered when it came wearing a tailored suit. The words echoed across the marble walls. Nobody challenged him this time. Maya felt something unfamiliar settle into the room then. Not victory. Something quieter. Recognition. The kind that arrives too late to erase humiliation, but still changes everything afterward. Edward looked toward the untouched contracts one final time before speaking again. Miss Bennett, he said carefully, would you sit at this table for the rest of the meeting? Maya Bennett froze for half a second after Edward Whitmore invited her to sit at the table. The request felt unreal inside a room that had laughed at her less than an hour earlier. Nobody spoke while she slowly looked around the boardroom, almost expecting someone to object. But the executives who had smirked at her before now avoided her eyes completely. Rain continued rolling down the massive windows overlooking Manhattan, softening the city lights into blurred rivers of white and gold. Maya could hear the faint hum of the building ventilation above the silence. Edward pulled out one of the empty leather chairs himself. Please, he said again, calmer this time. Maya carefully stepped forward. Her shoes pressed softly against the polished floor as she crossed the distance between the wall and the table where billion-dollar decisions were made. The same table she had not even been considered worthy to stand near at the start of the night. She sat carefully, smoothing her black uniform against her knees while every executive in the room watched her differently now. Not comfortably, not proudly, almost cautiously. Claire Whitmore slid the merger documents toward her without hesitation. Can you show me exactly where the forecasting manipulation begins? She asked quietly. Maya nodded once. Her hands still trembled faintly from adrenaline, but once she focused on the numbers, the fear started fading beneath instinct. This part felt familiar. Numbers made sense to her in ways people often did not. Here, she said, pointing to the energy projections. The liability structure repeats the same debt exposure under multiple subsidiaries. Claire's eyes widened again. That doubles the projected losses artificially. Exactly. One executive leaned forward slowly, which forces Whitmore Holdings into the transfer trigger. Maya nodded again. Around the room, the realization spread visibly across faces that had once looked amused. Graham Cole remained standing near the opposite end of the table, but now he looked isolated rather than powerful. The confidence that filled the room when he first arrived had completely vanished. Edward studied Maya carefully while she explained the structure line by line. He noticed how naturally she spoke once nobody interrupted her. No hesitation, no uncertainty, just clarity. It unsettled him more than the contract itself, because it forced him to confront something ugly about the world he had spent his entire life inside. He thought about how quickly everyone in the room dismissed her the moment they saw the uniform, the skin color, the position, himself included. Maya pointed toward another section near the back pages. This clause reroutes operational voting power after projected underperformance, she explained. But the underperformance is mathematically guaranteed by the manipulated forecasts. One executive quietly whispered, "Unbelievable." Graham finally stepped forward again. "You are all acting as though she uncovered some criminal conspiracy." Maya looked up at him calmly. "No," she said softly. "Just a system built around assuming nobody would question you." The sentence landed with painful precision. Edward Whitmore slowly removed his glasses and rubbed one hand across his face. He suddenly looked older beneath the chandelier light. More tired. "How many people like her have we overlooked?" he asked quietly, almost to himself. Nobody answered, because everyone in the room already knew the truth. Too many. Maya glanced down at the polished table reflecting the city lights above it. She remembered nights studying corporate finance beside her mother's hospital bed while nurses whispered nearby under fluorescent lights. She remembered professors who praised her brilliance but still assumed scholarships were the only reason she belonged there. She remembered shrinking herself over and over just to survive spaces that treated confidence differently, depending on who carried it. Edward looked toward her again. "Miss Bennett," he said carefully, "why did you speak up tonight when you could have simply walked away?" Maya was quiet for a moment. Then she answered in the softest voice anyone had heard all evening. "Because people lose jobs when powerful men stop listening." And this time, nobody in the room could look away from her. The boardroom remained completely still after Maya Bennett spoke. Because people lose jobs when powerful men stop listening. The sentence hung in the air heavier than any financial number discussed that night. Rain slid down the enormous glass windows behind the executives, while distant lightning briefly illuminated the Manhattan skyline in pale silver flashes. Nobody touched the merger documents anymore. Nobody looked at Graham Cole. The polished confidence that once filled the room had collapsed into something quieter and harder to ignore. Shame. Edward Whitmore slowly lowered his eyes toward the contract spread across the marble table. For the first time in years, the billionaire felt embarrassed inside his own boardroom. Not because he almost signed a disastrous merger, because he realized how quickly he had dismissed the only person who tried to protect him. Maya sat quietly near the end of the table now, her black service uniform contrasting sharply against the expensive suits surrounding her. She looked exhausted beneath the chandelier lights. There were faint shadows under her eyes that no makeup could hide. Edward suddenly understood that while everyone in this room had been debating billions of dollars, she had probably been worrying about grocery bills, hospital visits, and subway rides home after midnight shifts. The imbalance of it sat heavily in his chest. Claire Whitmore closed the final folder and pushed it away from her. "The merger is finished," she said firmly. "There is no version of this deal that survives legal review now." Graham exhaled slowly through his nose. "You are making a very expensive mistake." Edward looked up at him calmly. "No, I almost made one." Silence followed again. The older executives who once laughed at Maya now sat motionless, unable to meet her eyes for very long. One man quietly removed his watch and stared at the reflection of the chandelier light across its glass face, as if trying to avoid confronting himself. Another folded the merger papers carefully, almost respectfully now. Edward finally turned toward Maya completely. "Miss Bennett," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." The words stunned the room more than any financial revelation that night. Billionaires were not known for apologizing, especially not to hotel staff. Maya looked surprised herself. Edward stood slowly from his chair and walked around the marble table until he stood directly across from her. His voice lost the cold executive sharpness it carried earlier in the evening. "When you first spoke," he admitted, "I saw your uniform before I heard your intelligence." Maya lowered her eyes briefly, not because she was ashamed, but because hearing someone powerful finally say the truth out loud carried its own kind of weight. Edward continued quietly, "That failure belongs to me." Nobody interrupted him. Rainwater tapped softly against the windows while the city lights flickered through the storm outside. Maya thought about all the times she had swallowed words in rooms like this because experience taught her speaking up came with consequences. She remembered professors who assumed she needed extra help before reading her work, customers who handed business questions to white coworkers standing beside her, security guards who watched her longer than everyone else inside expensive stores. Tiny humiliations stacked together year after year until silence felt safer than confidence. But tonight, for once, somebody powerful acknowledged it without forcing her to explain. Edward carefully pulled a business card from his suit pocket and placed it on the table in front of her. "Whitmore Holdings has a graduate financial analyst position opening next quarter," he said. "If you are willing, I would like you to interview for it." Several executives looked stunned again. Maya stared at the card without touching it. The gold lettering reflected softly beneath the chandelier light. "Sir," she said carefully, "I do not even have my degree anymore." Edward gave the smallest shake of his head. "No," he replied quietly. "You have something much rarer than that. You noticed the truth when everyone else in this room chose comfort instead." For a long moment, Maya Bennett simply stared at the business card resting on the marble table in front of her. The gold lettering shimmered beneath the chandelier light, while rain continued falling against the towering windows overlooking Manhattan. Nobody in the boardroom spoke. The silence no longer felt cruel or tense. It felt reflective, almost fragile, as though everyone inside the room understood something important had shifted and none of them fully knew how to return to who they were before tonight. Maya carefully picked up the card between her fingers. "Whitmore Holdings, Graduate Financial Analyst Program." The words blurred slightly as emotion tightened unexpectedly in her chest. Not because of the job offer itself, but because for the first time in years somebody looked at her mind before judging her circumstances. Edward Whitmore remained standing across from her, his posture calmer now, stripped of the cold authority that had filled the room earlier that evening. "You earned that opportunity tonight," he said quietly. Maya shook her head once. "I was just trying to stop a bad deal." Edward gave a faint smile that carried more regret than amusement. "Most people in this room saw risk to profits," he replied. "You saw risk to people." The sentence settled softly across the boardroom. Claire Whitmore looked toward Maya with open admiration now, no trace of the distance that existed between them at the beginning of the night. Even the executives who had laughed earlier seemed smaller somehow beneath the soft chandelier glow. One by one, they began quietly gathering their papers, but nobody rushed to leave. It was as though walking out too quickly would force them to admit what this night revealed about themselves. Graham Cole finally reached for his briefcase in silence. The polished arrogance he arrived with had vanished completely. He paused near the end of the table before looking toward Maya one final time. For a second it seemed like he might say something defensive, something sharp to reclaim control. But he did not, because there was nothing left to argue against. The truth had already settled too deeply into the room. He simply turned and walked away beneath the muted sound of rain tapping against glass. Maya watched the elevator doors close behind him through the reflection in the windows. Then the room fell quiet again. Edward loosened his tie slightly and glanced toward the skyline outside. "Do you know what bothers me most?" he asked softly. Nobody answered. He looked back toward Maya. "You almost stayed silent because this room taught you not to expect respect from people like us." Maya lowered her eyes briefly. The painful part was that he was right. She thought about all the